New York, Mr. Torres is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Always a pleasure, Madam Secretary. You've been a true friend of public housing, as you promised you would be. The New York City Housing Authority, which is in a state of crisis, needs every dollar it can get, and I appreciate everything that you and Deputy Secretary Todman have done to enable NYCHA to access new streams of federal funding. As you know, the story of public housing is largely a story of federal disinvestment, congressional disinvestment. NYCHA has historically not received the full formula funding to which it is statutorily entitled. And since federal funding for public housing is subject to the whims of congressional appropriations, NYCHA has received only a percentage or a proration of the full formula funding. So as a result, since 2001, NYCHA has seen a cumulative loss of over $1 billion in operating subsidies and over a $500 million loss in capital grants. NYCHA's annual proration has fallen to levels as low as 82%. And so by way of comparison, imagine telling a private landlord you're only going to receive 82% of the revenues you need to operate your properties. How do you think most landlords would respond to the sudden loss of nearly 20% of their revenues?
They would not be very happy, certainly. And it would create an environment where they may not even be able to continue to do business in that way.
So Congress holds public housing to a double standard. Congress imposes on public housing authorities the kind of funding losses that no private landlord would ever be reasonably expected to absorb. Congress starves public housing of the funding it needs, sets it up to fail, and then scapegoats public housing authorities and HUD for the failure that Congress has brought upon them. Instead of deflecting blame, Congress should look in the mirror. Congress itself has long been the worst slumlord in the United States, subjecting public housing to decades of demolition by neglect. If private landlords did to private housing what Congress has done to public housing, those private landlords would be sent to prison for endangering the welfare of their tenants, and rightfully so. So public housing is not just a footnote in the federal budget. There are millions of people who live in these units. And when aging elevators and boilers are breaking down and when roofs and bricks come crashing down, lives are put at risk. And yet those lives, largely black and brown, are often overlooked. On a new topic, the Federal Financing Bank Risk Share Program is a partnership between HUD and Treasury. It provides low-cost capital that finances affordable housing. FFB has largely been a success story, financing over 38,000 units of affordable housing throughout the United States. Even though it has been effective, FFB is due to sunset in 2024. Does HUD support a long-term extension of FFB?
We want to make it permanent, Congressman.
That's great. And I've spoken to a few housing finance agencies that would love to see greater flexibility in FFB. Is HUD willing to improve upon FFB to provide housing finance agencies with greater flexibility?
Yes.
That's great. And on a separate topic, as you might have seen in the news, a building collapse in the Bronx led to the displacement of more than 100 residents. Since HUD is one of the leading funding sources for affordable housing, do you believe, as I do, that HUD has a vested interest in ensuring that all HUD-assisted housing is structurally sound and that the people who live there are physically safe?
Yes. Can I just say this?
Of course, absolutely.
One of the things that I have determined that is going to be the determinant if we are a success is that people know that we don't want them to live in housing that is substandard or housing that is not safe. It is my personal priority.
I appreciate that. And Congressman Adriano Espaillat and I represent the West Bronx, where the building collapse took place, and we would love to work with you to figure out how do we improve the federal government's role in building safety? How do we support local and state efforts to promote building safety and affordable housing? So I hope we can work with you.
There's no question that we will.
And I just want to respond. I feel like a number of my Republican colleagues feel like it's a mystery. Why is there so much homelessness? And I think my view is that the solution to homelessness is a home. When you have fewer homes than people need, you're going to have more homelessness. And so in order to have more homes, it requires more investment. Like the notion that you can defund HUD, defund affordable housing programs, and then magically create enough affordable housing to meet the demand. I think Congress is living in la-la land. So I just I just think the lack of common sense that's underlying some of the questions that I've heard today has been staggering, but I appreciate your public service.
Thank you so much, Congressman.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Flood.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Torres, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. On December 16th, 2023, the New York Times wrote an expose about the, quote, money machine that generates terrorism financing for Hamas. Here's a relevant excerpt from the expose. Quote, the ledgers from the computer of a senior Hamas official listed assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Hamas controlled mining, chicken farming, and road building companies in Sudan, 2 skyscrapers in the United Arab Emirates, a property developer in Algeria, and a real estate firm listed on the Turkish stock exchange. It continues, quote, the Israeli agents who obtained the records shared them inside their own government, and in Washington, nothing happened. So did the Financial Intelligence Unit of the United States know that Hamas had a multinational network of companies from which it could generate terrorism financing?
Thank you for the question. And just to step back one step, we're obviously very aware of that press reporting. And indeed, in March of or May of 2022, we designated the entity on the Turkish stock market because of this concern. And in that context, we talked about this significant investment portfolio and our long historic efforts to try to dismantle exactly that.
You designated it when?
Trend GYO, it was in, I think, May of 23. So this is prior to October.
And how long before then?
May of 22.
How long before then did you know that that company was connected to Hamas?
You know, so we go through a process where we have to develop an evidentiary package that meets legal sufficiency and work through our interagency. But we've been targeting Hamas and Hamas's financial infrastructure for literally decades. So this is something.
But specifically the companies that were, the Turkish company and the companies that were appeared in the New York Times expose. How long, when did you first receive financial intel about those companies?
Again, we get intelligence from a lot of sources. We work through the evidentiary package, and then once we have legal sufficiency, we will either move to designation or certainly have an interagency policy conversation.
I'm not clear if your answer is responsive to my question, but apart from the Turkish company, did the U.S. sanction all the known companies generating terrorism financing for Hamas?
So we have been, and I have personally been focused on going around the globe, working with Gulf partners to identify and target all financial infrastructure that touches the international financial system. As you know, Hamas has historically generated
But I don't mean to, I'm just impressed for time. Did the United
majority
States,
of its money domestically.
did the United States sanction any Hamas-connected company beyond the Turkish firm that you referenced?
Just in the last number of months, we've done 5 rounds of designations and have sanctioned a number of entities and people, and including associated with that Turkish company.
I have a question about CVC mixing, and I share the concern that the abuse of CVC mixing is a genuine security concern. But if you're a financial institution and you see a suspicious transaction involving CVC mixing, you are presently required to file a suspicious activity report with FinCEN. So what new information would you obtain under the proposed rule that you could not obtain under existing regulations?
Thank you, Representative Torres. You know, the CVC mixing notice of proposed rulemaking just closed, so I don't want to, and expect that this is a comment that we will review. We will certainly look to minimize burden and make sure that this is a new requirement, but our experience in reviewing suspicious activity reports didn't reveal that we were getting all the reporting that we thought we would expect through mixing. So regarding mixing, so this is something we will look closely at and take your point on this.
And the United States has a strategic interest in maintaining a unipolar financial system built on the US dollar. But I wonder, has America been too aggressive in the use of sanctions? Do you worry at all about the unintended consequence of incentivizing de-dollarization? if the world were to shift from a unipolar financial system to a multipolar financial system, it could render U.S. sanctions far less enforceable and far less effective. So how are you thinking about that trade-off?
It's a great question. We don't think sanctions is going to lead to the de-dollarization or lead to the dollar not being an international reserve currency, but we do have gone through a process of identifying ways we can make our sanctions regime much more effective and have a new unit, the Sanctions Economic Analysis Division, to look at these questions as well. Okay.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Loudermilk, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for being here.
Gentleman yields back. We'll go to the last questioner of the day, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Torres, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I have several questions about some of the most common complaints that I've heard about Basel III Endgame. I have an open mind on the subject, but I want to hear your response to some of the arguments that have been leveled against it. First, the Fed has repeatedly reassured the public that the banking system is well capitalized. Yet the Fed is advancing Basel III on the assumption that the banking system is undercapitalized. So the first question is, how do you reconcile the Fed's repeat assurances about a well-capitalized banking system with Basel III's assumption of an undercapitalized banking system? The second question, if the purpose of Basel III is to align U.S. banks with their banking peers elsewhere in the world, why is the Fed imposing requirements that are more stringent than those prescribed by Basel III? In other words, why is the Fed, quote unquote, gold plating? The third question is, how do you reconcile Basel III's recommendation for standardization with Congress's statutory requirement for tailoring? Standardization would seem to be in conflict or in tension with regulatory tailoring. And the fourth and final question, do you think that Basel III could have the unintended consequence of reinforcing the trend toward shadow banking, which would mean less regulation, not more? Is there a sense in which we are transferring risk from the regulated sector of the financial system to the deregulated sector? So I bombarded you with 4 questions, and I'll give you the time you need to answer them.
I'm going to have a hard time reading my handwriting here, but I'll start with yes to the fourth one. I'll give you that one because that is clearly a risk. We've seen intermediation activity moving out of the regulated system, and this has the risk of doing more of that. So what was, in a word or two, what was the one again?
Just you said, you testified and
capital, yeah.
repeat reassurances about the capitalization of the banking
So
system.
I addressed this in my remarks in the open board meeting. Higher capital is always going to add to safety and soundness, but there's a cost.
Right.
And so identifying the precise right level is very, very difficult. It's hard to do it objectively. I've said for years in these rooms that I thought that the level of capital in the U.S. banking system was about right. So I posed, and I voted for all these increases during Dodd-Frank, so I think it's a very fair question. We'll be looking at that. The second one was?
The concern about gold plating.
About?
Gold plating?
Oh, gold plating, yeah, no, it is, and I said this in my public remarks, that we're exceeding the minimums with this proposal, and we also exceeded what the other big jurisdictions are doing, and so that's a question. That's a good question. I'll agree.
Okay, great.
And the third?
And the third is, I think you more or less, and standardization versus tailoring.
Standardization of, it was something specific.
Yeah, so Congress passed a statute requiring regulatory tailoring.
No, that's an
and do you
excellent
think
question.
Basel III is in compliance with that
I addressed that
statute?
in my comments too. I think you're right. We do need to take on board the lessons of Silicon Valley Bank as it relates to the smaller, large banks, but we don't need to throw away the tailoring that's required by the law, but also that is appropriate if we're going to have a diverse banking system.
The collapse of SVB was largely a story about liquidity risk and interest rate risk, yet the focal points of Basel III are credit risk, market rate risk, and operational risk. What is your response to the criticism that the Fed should focus its energies on addressing the forms of risk that were responsible for the SVB bank failure rather than focusing on forms of risk that were largely unrelated to it?
So I agree with that, but I would say we are working on a package of liquidity measures which directly addresses the Silicon Valley Bank situation. We've also taken a lot of supervisory actions with other medium and small sized banks that had a lot of uninsured deposits and a lot of real estate risk and things like that. So we've been doing quite a lot on the supervisory section that it doesn't require new rules.
And then finally, as you know, the crippling cost of housing accounts for a third of inflation. One of the most powerful tools for producing and preserving affordable housing is the low-income housing tax credit, which has financed nearly 4 million units of affordable housing. The banking system accounts for 85% of LIHTC investments, and there's a concern that Basel III, in its present form, would diminish the availability of LIHTC and the amount of affordable housing development. And so I'm just curious, is that on your radar, and is that something you're willing to examine?
Yes, it is.
So with that, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Gentleman is yielded.
Impact discrimination?
Yes.
Do you believe that exclusionary zoning, in as much as it produces a disparate impact, violates the Fair Housing Act?
Yes.
Do you believe that HUD should enforce the Fair Housing Act against exclusionary zoning?
Yes. And I need to clarify that a lot of the challenges at the local level are based on local laws and lot sizes. And if we were able to actually have localities be incentivized with the 85 million that HUD is using to try to incentivize the localities to change those laws, we could actually increase opportunities to address the fair and affordable housing crisis.
But even though zoning is a state and local issue, if it violates the Fair Housing Act, it becomes a federal constitutional concern, right?
Yes.
Okay. I think we all agree that there's an urgent need to expand housing supply. Expanded housing supply will require greater housing subsidy from the federal government and greater land use reform from state and local governments, but there's a third variable that affects housing supply: cost. If we can figure out how to cut the actual cost of housing development in half, then in theory, we could cut rent, maintenance, mortgage payments in half. So a question for each of you: what is the most promising strategy that you have seen for fundamentally reducing the cost of housing development and housing construction in America? And we'll start with the Mortgage Bankers Association.
Yeah, so I think it's been interesting to see in Massachusetts, California, other parts of the country, the state level government really sort of leaning into local governments to try to increase density. And I think that's probably the most effective way this is going to be done at the state and local level, is just where it makes sense, increase density.
Increasing density is certainly important, but I also think that when we look at building more homes, we have to look at the other problems that are holding back building. Certainly, there are local laws that are restricting building and holding that back that go beyond density. And so looking at those laws, I think is quite important, like the number of shrubs and trees that need to be planted on a lot to have a single-family home go in, things like that really could expand the number of homes.
Fully enforcing our nation's civil rights laws, there is a provision, the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing provision, under the Fair Housing Act. It requires two things: for localities and states that are receiving federal dollars for housing and community development to stop discriminating, and then to create inclusive communities going forward. We've yet to have full enforcement, quite frankly, because HUD has been under-resourced by the prior administration. And HUD, during this administration, had to do yeoman's work to really build up the staffing at the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity to really approach this work with the rigor that's required. And if I may just speak to one issue about where we are in terms of building and costs. We didn't arrive at here by an accident. We actually underbuilt following the Great Recession. Builders actually built homes at the higher end of the marketplace, excluding building opportunities at the lower end of the marketplace. So we didn't just come here from an accident where we need to now focus on supply-side strategies. By failing to focus on demand-side strategies, we've exacerbated and actually grown the crisis. If the House had passed the Build Back Better Act, which is now the legislation that the ranking member mentioned, the Housing Crisis Response Act, if we had passed that legislation, millions of consumers would have got the housing relief that they need, and the overall market would be stronger.
I have a question about the relationship between median home prices and median household incomes. Median home prices have been stagnating. Median home prices have been rising astronomically, whereas median household incomes have been stagnating, and the gap between prices and incomes have been widening. Like, at what point does that gap become unsustainable? What is a healthy ratio of home price to household income? Yeah, Dr. Lutz, if you want to.
So I think when we're looking at this, we have to keep in mind that while first-time homebuyers are really struggling to enter into the market, homeowners have had incredible wealth gains. And so 32% of the market paying all cash, a quarter of repeat home buyers who are primary residence buyers are paying all cash, they're not going to be wedded as much to what their income is versus the gain in home prices because of the ability to gain equity over time and make this all cash purchase. And right now, we are seeing a lot of boomers do this.
And many of these people have the ability to pay all cash because the Fed's policies to rescue the market during COVID did not land equally in every community. Wealthier borrowers were able to take advantage of refinances at historically low rates, whereas borrowers of color were not able to do so. So we saw the black homeownership rate actually, a black-white rate, homeownership wealth gap rather, grow by $20 trillion because of those inequitable policies.
Thank you.
The gentleman from New York, Mr. Garbarino, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Dr. Frantantoni, the purpose of this hearing is to examine the challenges facing today's.
The gentleman from New York, Mr. Torres, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. In January 2022, Fed Chair Jerome Powell said, quote, "Capital and liquidity levels at our largest, most systemically important banks are at multi-decade highs." In June of 2023, Fed Chair Powell described the banking system as, quote, "very strongly capitalized." In June of 2023, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said, quote, "Our banking system is well capitalized. There is adequate capital and liquidity in America's banking system." Dr. Gibson, do you agree with those statements from the Fed Chair and the Treasury Secretary?
Yes.
And so the Fed Chair's repeated reassurances about a well-capitalized banking system seems to flatly contradict Basel III's assumption of an undercapitalized banking system. What do you make of that contradiction?
The main objective of the Basel III endgame proposal was to make capital requirements more risk-sensitive and more consistent and adequately reflect risk. That's the goal.
Do you think the banking system is undercapitalized or sufficiently capitalized?
That's one of the things we're looking at through the comment period, so we've gotten a lot of comments about that, and we're going to evaluate that.
Because Fed Chair Powell described it as very strongly capitalized, so the rhetoric from the Fed historically would seem to suggest that it's sufficiently capitalized. You know, I ask myself, given the well-capitalized state of the banking system, you know, are we fixing what ain't broken? You know, what is the actual need for Basel III? A common refrain that I've heard about Basel III is that the United States must conform to European standards of banking. And I'm wondering, where did we get this notion that the United States, as the financial superpower of the world, must conform to European standards of banking? As a US policymaker, the most important question for me is not whether the US banking system is acting in conformity with Europe's banking system. The most important question is whether the US banking system is achieving the best possible balance between economic growth and financial stability. Like that should be the question that matters to all of you. And so do you believe, as I do, that the end goal should not be the Europeanization of the US financial system? The end goal should be the optimization of economic growth and financial stability?
So our goal is a strong U.S. banking system to support a strong U.S. economy.
Do you agree that the goal should be the optimization of economic growth and financial stability?
Yes.
Okay. And have you conducted a study aimed at determining the level of capital requirements that would produce the optimal amount of economic growth and financial stability?
So the notice of proposed rulemaking last year included that information, and we've received a lot of comment about that, and we're evaluating those.
So have you conducted a study?
There were studies cited in the notice of proposed rulemaking.
But has the Federal Reserve itself conducted a study to determine what level of capital requirements would produce the optimal amount of economic growth and financial stability? It's a simple yes or no question.
Yes, and it was cited in the.
Okay, you did conduct a study.
It's in the proposal.
Okay. There are those who insist that Basel III capital requirements would have no impact on access to credit. You know, the laws of economics tell us that there's no such thing as a free lunch, right? Nothing is free, everything has a cost. I mean, do you believe that Basel III is an exception to the laws of economics, that Basel III is somehow a free lunch that would have no impact on the availability of credit?
There's definitely costs and benefits.
So it would have an impact on the availability of credit. You know, there are housing finance agencies that have expressed concerns about the impact of Basel III on the low-income housing tax credit equity investments, 85% of which come from the banking system. There are housing organizations that have expressed concerns about the impact of Basel III on minority borrowers and LMI borrowers who disproportionately access mortgages with lower down payments and higher loan-to-value ratios. I mean, do you acknowledge that those are genuine trade-offs?
Yes, and we've gotten a lot of comment on exactly those issues, and we're definitely going to carefully consider those as we work on the final rule.
And you agree that an act of Congress supersedes Basel III recommendation? Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Okay. So if there were a conflict between a congressional statute and a Basel III recommendation, the congressional statute should prevail.
I mean,
Because there have been concerns that there's a conflict between Basel III's requirement for standardization and Congress's requirement for regulatory tailoring.
I mean, everything we would, any proposal we make would be evaluated by our lawyers to make sure it's consistent with the statutory
I see my time has expired, so.
Medical billers get.
Reclaiming my time, thank you. My time has now expired. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Torres, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Director Chopra, I commend you for your decision to propose the exclusion of medical debt from credit reporting. Medical debt is often the consequence of the unforeseeable, and therefore it reveals next to nothing about the underlying creditworthiness of an individual borrower. America's conventional credit scoring methodology, to me, is fundamentally obsolete. Not only does it include factors that have no informative value, like medical debt, it often excludes factors that have informative value, like rental payments. If credit reporting were to factor in alternative data like rent payments, most of the population, if not all, almost all of it, would become credit scorable. If GSEs, like the Federal Home Loan Bank of New York, Freddie Mae, and Fannie Mac, were to use credit scores that include rent payments and exclude medical debt, as required by law, millions of more Americans would have access to home ownership. 20,000 of my constituents in the Bronx, in New York 15, would have access to home ownership. So for me, the single greatest solution to systemic racism in America is the creation of black and brown wealth through expanded access to credit and expanded access to home ownership. For the lowest income communities of color, there's nothing comparable to home ownership as a tool for broad-based wealth creation. I appreciate your mention earlier of trigger leads. You know, I have serious concerns that unregulated trigger leads fundamentally undermine consumer protection and data privacy. When consumers apply for a mortgage, a credit reporting agency will often sell their private information without their knowledge and consent. Within hours of applying for a mortgage, consumers are often blindsided by a bombardment of telemarketing calls. Some of the lenders behind these calls are often bottom feeders, engaging in unfair and deceptive business practices. And so I worry that poorly regulated trigger leads are often an open invitation to predatory lending against unsuspecting borrowers. I'm curious, would you support legislation that would regulate trigger leads?
Yeah, I really have concerns about the big credit reporting conglomerates making money off of this, especially when we don't even know if these offers are really competitive or legitimate. You mentioned, Congressman Torres, that they might be bottom feeders. We don't even hear that much that these leads are leading to more competition, right. But I really do. I've talked to you and Congressman Rose about it. I think this is a key privacy issue we should work on.
Look, I mean, I feel deregulated trigger leads leads to predatory lending under the guise of choice and competition. Maybe the theory is that it will lead to more choice and competition, but the reality is that it's led to more exploitation. As you know, June is Pride Month, and so I have a few questions in the spirit of Pride Month. The Urban Institute released a report finding a 20% home ownership gap based on sexual orientation and gender identity. 5% of the 20% home ownership gap cannot be explained by existing data. And so as the administrator of the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, CFPB is in a position to mandate the disclosure of more data so that researchers like the Urban Institute can ascertain the causes of the unexplained 5% home ownership gap. Is the CFPB willing to take action to expand the scope of the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act to include data relating to sexual orientation and gender identity?
Yeah, we're thinking of looking more deeply in general at the homeownership gap in older homeowners, and there's certainly issues when it comes to sexual orientation and other factors. With respect to Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, there's a number of issues that we are looking at for modernization of that, and that is certainly one of them. I think it's not slated in the very near term, but when we do an assessment and we look at it, I think that's going to be something that we will also have to comply with Supreme Court precedent on this.
The CFPB administers not only the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, but also the Consumer Complaints Database, which is an abundant source of data. Is the CFPB willing to expand the scope of the Consumer Complaint Database intake form to include sexual orientation and gender identity?
We may have done some consumer testing on different identification factors. I think there's always the balance of how to get people through and file, but I'm happy to ask the staff about whether that's been done before.
And just a final question on medical debt. You know, even if there's a process for disputing, don't you think we should get it right the first time?
Yeah, and often when people dispute, the immediate answer is that it's correct without showing any receipts.
But we should strive for maximum accuracy at the very beginning of the process.
Actually, it's the law for those credit reporting conglomerates to have reasonable procedures to, quote, assure maximum possible accuracy.
I think my time has expired.
Thank you. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Dollins, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Director Chopra, welcome back. Question. So the CFPB refer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For far too long, the United States has been planting the seeds of its own decline through a series of strategic miscalculations and misplaced priorities. First came the deindustrialization of America. We made a miscalculation in allowing our domestic industrial capacity to atrophy from neglect. And then came the distraction of America. We made a miscalculation in allowing ourselves to be distracted by quagmires in the Middle East from the singular challenge to American leadership, which is the Chinese Communist Party. Thankfully, under the leadership of President Biden, aided by a bipartisan consensus here in Congress, we are correcting these historical errors to the benefit of U.S. strategic competitiveness. One of the greatest achievements of the Biden administration lies in fundamentally changing the trajectory of the semiconductor arms race, or what Mr. Miller calls the chip wars. Both the CHIP Act and the export controls on China have been game changers. According to a report by the Semiconductor Industry Association and the Boston Consulting Group, by 2032, the United States will account for 30% of advanced semiconductor production, compared to only 2% for China. Mr. Miller, what is the percentage of advanced semiconductors that are projected to come not only from onshoring, but also from nearshoring and friendshoring beyond the reach of the Chinese Communist Party?
Representative, I think we're seeing substantial investments both in the United States, but also in allied countries, in Europe, in Japan, in other partners, that is adding to the resilience of the semiconductor supply chain.
And to what extent does the restrictiveness of America's immigration system undermine the capacity to domestically produce advanced semiconductors?
Representative, I think if we could have more immigrants with high skills in the semiconductor industry, we'd have a more innovative ecosystem.
You know, the term protectionism is often invoked as a pejorative to denounce the policy shift away from so-called free trade. But in my view, there's nothing remotely free about trade with China. The idealized vision of free trade implies a level playing field in which everyone is playing by the rules. China has never been one to play by the rules. China is heavily subsidizing its own industries in order to drive American manufacturers out of business. That is not competition. That is cheating. And President Biden's tariffs are protecting American manufacturers not from competition, but from cheating. Mr. Paul, do you believe, as I do, that the protectionism versus free trade framing ignores the reality of cheating on the part of the Chinese Communist Party?
Yes, it's an easy headline, but it doesn't distill all of the issues involved. And I would just point out there's a difference between building a moat or a wall around your country and simply locking your door, which is what I think the tariffs do, which is smart. No one wants to let something bad happen in their house. Yeah.
I feel like we in the China Committee have no greater mission than to prevent a third world war. between the United States and China to prevent China from escalating aggression in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait. And a war in the Indo-Pacific, as you know, would largely be a naval war. And according to the Secretary of the Navy, quote, one Chinese shipyard has more capacity than all of our shipyards combined. You know, we have a reputation as the military superpower, the naval superpower of the world. You know, are we truly the naval superpower of the world when we have no independent shipbuilding capacity and when ours pales in comparison to our greatest rival?
I would say it's diminishing, and that is the concern here, is that we currently have a tonnage advantage, but it's unsustainable. We don't have a surge capacity. I mean, the thing that helped identify, and I'm glad the chairman mentioned the arsenal of democracy, was that we were able to do conversions very quickly to scale up battleship building capacity. And the difference now is that we don't have that. I mean, that has disappeared. We do have some shipyards that have been converted to just doing repair work that we could scale back up, but we are dangerously deficient when it comes to scaling up to meet the kind of conflict that you're talking about for any sustained amount of time.
Mr. Miller, just one more question about, obviously much has been said about this China's overcapacity of legacy chip making. Do you think that the risk to the supply chain security of the United States is so serious that it warrants a policy response from the United States, and what should that policy response be?
Yes, I think a policy response is warranted. I think some mix of trade measures and restrictions on use of Chinese semiconductors in critical systems should be examined as potential policy responses.
My time has expired, so thank you.
Gentleman from New York, Mr. Torres, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chair Powell, the Fed has an inflation rate target of 2%. Are you waiting for both PCE inflation and CPI inflation to fall to 2%, or only one of those metrics?
So we look at different measures, but for a quarter of a century, the PCE inflation has been the Fed's goal. We've defined our goal in terms of that because we think it's the better measure of the costs and inflation that the public actually faces.
And you know, you've said that you're willing to cut interest rates before reaching the 2% target. Is the decision to cut interest rates going to be driven by reaching a particular target en route to 2%, or is it driven by the overall trajectory of the inflation rate?
It's going to be driven by the totality of the data. There isn't a particular number that we have in mind that we have to get to. It's more, you look at all of the data, and the question we're asking ourselves is, are we sufficiently confident that inflation really is moving down toward 2%? So what's the underlying inflation rate, looking through the volatility? We're also looking, though, as I mentioned, at the labor market, and we're asking ourselves, you know, we have to take into account now maximum employment, that mandate. So we're looking at both of those in the decisions that we make.
I mean, are you confident that the inflation rate is on a downward trajectory?
I do have some confidence of that. I think we've seen that over the past several years. The question is, are we sufficiently confident that it is moving sustainably down to 2%? And I'm not prepared to say that yet.
Chair Powell, you announced a reproposal of Basel III rather than a mere revision. Do you believe that the U.S. banking system is sufficiently capitalized in the absence of Basel III?
I've long been of the view that U.S. banks are well capitalized, and at the level of capital in the U.S. banking system is about right.
Okay. So if the banking system is sufficiently capitalized in the absence of Basel III, then what exactly is the need for Basel III?
First of all, there's no precise answer as to the appropriate level of capital. I think we've been part of developing the Basel standards. They create international broad parity. It's important that we have that. It's important that we do something that is comparable to what the other large jurisdictions are doing, and that it's consistent with Basel. And I think that's what our banks want, that's what we want, and that will be best serving the public.
But you agree we should conform without gold plating?
You know, some things we've gold plated, and some things we haven't. And but I think we should make. I think our end game proposal should be at the end. Should be consistent with the requirements of Basel and consistent with what the other large jurisdictions are doing.
Are you confident that there's no legal conflict between the standardization recommended by Basel III and the regulatory tailoring mandated by Congress?
I think we can work through all that, yeah.
Okay. But if there were a conflict,
Basel doesn't impose any requirements on anyone. There's no enforceable requirements. Every jurisdiction does what it's going to do. Basel doesn't bind anybody.
right, but the regulatory framework you're adopting would codify those recommendations.
Yes.
Which would have the force of law, right?
Yes, that's right.
And so if there were a conflict between the codified recommendations and an act of Congress, would you agree that an act of Congress would supersede those
Yes.
recommendations?
Sure.
Does the loss of Chevron deference have any implications for Basel III?
You know, it's very early days to assess. There's several decisions that are about administrative law, and I think it's too early for us to say. I mean, ultimately, the question is, are the actions we're taking in compliance with the law? And that decision says that there will be a less deference or no deference, maybe, to the opinions of the agency, but that just means a court will be answering the same question, which is, are those actions consistent with the law?
The Fed has a target rate when it comes to inflation. Does the Fed have a target when it comes to quantitative tightening, like when it comes to what should be the size of the Fed's balance sheet?
Well, we don't have a specific target, no.
What would you consider to be a healthy size for the Fed's balance sheet?
We define it, not with numbers, but with words. And we want an ample reserves regime with a buffer so that reserves are not scarce. And we think plentiful reserves, ample reserves is the right place to be. And, we'll find that empirically.
Can you put a number on that?
No, I can't really.
For 4 decades, we've had the best of both worlds, low unemployment and low inflation. Can the U.S. economy return to the golden age of low unemployment and low inflation, or are we doomed to live with a new normal of higher interest rates?
Well, I think we have low inflation. We've got a period here of very low unemployment.
We have high inflation, so can we have the best of both worlds?
We certainly can, and that's the plan.
Okay.
We're going to return to 2% inflation. I'm reasonably confident. Some people argue that we're entering into a world of a lot of upward inflation shocks. That would be a challenging world, but that remains to be seen.
Thank you.
Torres for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Our subcommittee has jurisdiction over housing and insurance. The most commonly heard complaint that I've heard about the cost of housing is the crippling cost of insurance. Property insurance, liability insurance, which has been rising rapidly at a rate that affordable housing cannot afford. And so I would love to hear from each of you, what are your thoughts on what can be done to rein in the upward spiral in insurance costs?
I guess I can start if you like, Congressman.
Sure.
Thank you very much for the question, and you're absolutely right. The cost of insurance over the last couple of years has risen far in excess of many of the other operating costs and of our revenues at our properties. The degree to which that is influenced by casualty insurance is one factor, and we have to find ways to rein in the inflation on construction costs as one of the ingredients to rein in the cost of casualty insurance. Another, as you mentioned, is in liability. And liability insurance has increased proportionately with the increase in liability costs due to the inflationary nature of settlements that are occurring. So there's a broad range of causes, and I think we all need to work together not only to rein in any kind of price gouging that occurs, but to look at what are the causes, the insurance increases in the first place. I'm aware that many casualty insurance companies today are operating at current ratios that exceed 100%, meaning that their losses are exceeding the amount of premium that they're earning. So there are a lot of causes that we have to look at in order to rein this in.
Ms. Couch?
Thank you for the question. Rising insurance costs are a gigantic issue for affordable senior housing providers, and I think for all HUD-assisted housing providers. We need, in the senior housing space, we need products that are tailored to affordable senior housing. Too often, insurance providers couch senior housing as a healthcare setting, which it is not. It is an independent living setting. But to meet rising costs, to be able to buy insurance for their deductibles even, because the deductibles have gone so high. Our members are cutting their wellness programs, and not just to help pay for their rising insurance costs and their insurance on their deductible costs, but so that they don't get classified as having a wellness program, which is really counter to their missions to help residents age in place. We know that HUD is working really hard on this issue, trying to figure out what it can do for a largely state-regulated issue. We wonder, though, if HUD could be authorized by Congress to establish a property and liability insurance product of its own, so that the affordable housing programs within its universe could get some relief here.
The supply of senior housing is catastrophically lagging behind the need. America is in the midst of a silver tsunami, and we need to create enough senior housing to meet the needs of an aging population. According to a June 2024 report from Live On New York, there are more than 300,000 applications on the waiting list for HUD 202 senior housing, a program that is a shell of its former self. There's a narrative from my Republican colleagues that the government can only do harm to the housing market. It can do no good. I think economics tells us that when you subsidize something, you will get more of it. Ms. Couch, if we were to subsidize HUD 202 senior housing, would we get more of it?
We would have a lot more housing stability among older adults. We'd have a lot more units of affordable senior housing. HUD Section 202 program is HUD's flagship senior housing program, and it has been grossly underfunded, and now it is zeroed out for new housing. And this program in its heyday did exactly what we would want an affordable housing program to do. It provided the vast majority of the capital subsidy to build the housing, and then, and what it still does today, is it provides 40 years of ongoing operating subsidy. So you're never too poor to live in Section 202 housing, and your rent is always affordable to you. So we are huge fans of the Section 202 program, and our members are too.
Yeah. And there's a real need for innovation in housing, like innovations, whether it be modular construction, vertically integrated modular construction, 3D printing, has the potential to drive down the cost of housing. So I think we should think about how do we make the process of constructing affordable housing itself more affordable.
Bring it. Yeah, we're ready.
And I see my time has expired. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman.
4 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Torres, the co-sponsor of this bill.
The gentleman from New York, Mr. Torres, is recognized.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to partner with my colleague, the gentleman from New York, Representative Lawler, on a matter of urgent importance to our nation. The United States is entering an age of ever-escalating political violence, as evidenced by the violent assault on the United States Capitol on January 6th, and as evidenced by not one but 2 attempted assassinations of a former president. On July 13th, the difference between an attempted assassination and a completed assassination was not the skill of the Secret Service, it was luck. If the gunman had been slightly more precise in his shooting, or if the former president had moved ever so slightly to his right, the former president would have been killed. The fact that America stood inches and seconds away from a national crisis is itself a crisis. The security of a major presidential candidate, whether it be the Democratic nominee, Vice President Harris, or the Republican nominee, former President Donald Trump, cannot be left to chance. Hoping for the best or lucking out is not a policy prescription for protecting a president or a presidential candidate. Both the House and the Senate, both Democrats and Republicans, should be dedicated to a bipartisan, bicameral proposition that both major presidential candidates of both parties are entitled to the highest level of Secret Service protection, not only for their sake, but for our nation's. One final point, the Secret Service urgently needs not only more resources, but also deeper structural reforms. Only 30% of the Secret Service budget is dedicated to protective operations. The remaining 70% are spent on legacy functions that trace back to the Secret Service's time in the Treasury Department. The role the Secret Service plays in financial law enforcement does not reflect a rational allocation of resources and responsibilities. It is an accident of history, a relic of the past that should be re-examined by the United States Congress. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.